Hello and welcome to the Windows Modern with SOTI MobiControl series. My name is Richard, and in this video we'll explore how to enroll a Windows Modern device using the Microsoft Entra ID join option with SOTI MobiControl Cloud. You'll see a full walkthrough of how to integrate Microsoft Entra ID with SOTI MobiControl and how quick the enrollment experience is for the device user. We'll also review how the SOTI MobiControl Agent is installed shortly after enrollment for advanced management capability. So when it comes to enrollment and provisioning of a Windows Modern device, there are two main methods or routes that can be used. Firstly, there is a directory-based option, and secondly, there is a provisioning package which uses a certificate option. Now, there are use cases for both of these. So if I focus on the certificate-based enrollment, which is the provisioning package route, this can be very beneficial if, for example, the device isn't going to be used on a long-term basis by a specific user. An example of that may be a point of sale system or a digital signage device. Provisioning packages can be very useful for enrolling devices such as these. But in other cases, a directory-based enrollment method can be very suitable because this uses the Windows credentials of the user within the enrollment process. And the directory could be an on-premise directory, but also it could be a cloud-based directory, which is the focus of this video for today, where we're looking at Microsoft Entra ID. The steps that we're working through today can also be found on the SOTI MobiControl help documentation that can be accessed through SOTI Pulse. Our focus is setting up the connection for a cloud MobiControl instance. If you're using an on-premise version of SOTI MobiControl, there are a separate set of instructions working through the specifics. Many steps are very similar, however there are some important distinctions, including making sure that your on-premise domain is added as a record in Microsoft Entra ID and manually adding the app registration in Entra ID. With that said, let's work through the process for SOTI MobiControl Cloud. Before we start with our setup in SOTI MobiControl, we'll just spend a little bit of time getting the context of the users and groups that we'll be referring to in Microsoft Entra ID. So if I go to Microsoft Entra ID in the overview page, I can see information such as the tenant ID and the primary domain. This will be helpful for us in a few minutes' time. I can also check the groups that we have within this Microsoft Entra ID tenant. I can see that there's 8 groups overall, and the one that I'm focused on is this one here called Frontline Device Users. Within this group there is a user, and the user's name is Marcus. Now, what we'll be doing when we create our enrollment policy with SOTI MobiControl is querying the group called Frontline Device Users, and then when we enroll the device, Marcus should be able to put his information into the device, which will initiate the enrollment process to SOTI MobiControl. To start our connection to Microsoft Entra ID, we'll go to SOTI MobiControl, we'll go to the menu, and we'll go to the Global Settings area. We'll then go down to Services and Directory. And in here we can see there's the option to connect to LDAP directories, so on-premise directories, and also Microsoft Entra ID. Now you can see I've actually got a few connections already set up, but I don't yet have a connection for Windows Device Enrollment or Microsoft Entra ID Join, so let's go ahead and add that. I'll click the plus button and give this a name. And once I've given an overall name, I'll click the plus button and add in a name specific for this connection, along with the primary domain, tenant ID and metadata endpoint address from Microsoft Entra ID. Now I've added my name for the primary domain and tenant ID. Well, we can get that from the overview page of Entra ID that we saw a few minutes ago. So I'll go back to the Entra ID portal and I can just copy those two values, tenant ID and the primary domain. The metadata endpoint address can also be found in the Entra ID portal in the app registrations area. So within our menu, we'll go to App Registrations. There's no need to actually register an app if we're using SOTI MobiControl Cloud, but what we can do is select the endpoints option at the top, and the Federation metadata document, which is the value that we need, is the third item from the end of the list. Now we've got all these values added, if I scroll down, I can see that Azure AD or Entra ID Join Cloud Enrollment is listed within the default applications. This means that there's no need to add an app registration in Microsoft Entra ID or generate client IDs or secrets on the Entra ID portal. When we click Save, we'll be prompted to sign into Microsoft Entra ID, and there'll be a confirmation message of all of the relevant permissions that SOTI MobiControl requires to query the user groups and the users that we saw previously. So when we click Save, all we then need to do is select that we're using Azure AD or Entra ID Cloud Enrollment, click Save again, and at this point we're redirected to Microsoft's website to sign in. Please note, the individual signing into the Microsoft Entra ID portal will need to be an administrator with the ability to consent for these permissions on behalf of the organization. Once this is done, we have a successful setup message and we can return to the SOTI MobiControl console. Now that we've created our directory connection with Microsoft Entra ID, we should be able to proceed with creating an enrollment policy. However, just before we do, I'm going to go back to Microsoft Entra ID to call out one potential additional action. Now, when the Entra ID administrator accepts the users and permissions of that default application that we saw on SOTI MobiControl, the application will be created underneath Enterprise Applications. We can see it here. All of the relevant permissions should be enabled. However, if Microsoft do make changes, it's worth going into Security, Permissions, and then just granting consent for any additional permissions that you can see required. As said, this should be automated, but it's worth calling out this area just in case Microsoft change any of their API permissions. Now that this is done, we should be able to create our enrollment policy in SOTI MobiControl. So we'll go to Policies, Enrollment. We'll add a new enrollment policy, choosing Windows and Windows Modern. And the first thing we'll do is give this a clearly identifiable name and optional description. Next, we'll be prompted to select the enrollment type. We can choose from Directory Federated. This will be used if we're looking to connect to an on-premise directory. Provisioning Package, as described earlier. And this is the option we're using today, Microsoft Entra Join for a Cloud SOTI MobiControl. We'll click Next, and then we'll be prompted to query the user groups from a Microsoft Entra ID connection. I'll click the plus button. We can see the connection we created earlier in the global settings area of SOTI MobiControl. And I can search for our frontline device worker groups, and I can see that this is returned. And then we'll be prompted to say, well, where will the device be placed in SOTI MobiControl when it enrolls? I'll select this device group. So altogether, we're saying that when somebody from the frontline device worker group in Microsoft Entra ID initiates the enrollment process on the device will then be placed in this SOTI MobiControl device group when it successfully enrolls. In addition, terms and conditions are required for this enrollment option. The device user will see this as they initiate the enrollment process on the device. So I'll add some terms and conditions now. Now we've added our terms and conditions, we'll click OK. I'll select the terms and conditions that will be used for the frontline device worker group. And then finally on this screen, we have an unenrollment option that is linked to the Microsoft Entra ID user. So if the user in Microsoft Entra ID is disabled, we could say that the device will automatically be disabled in SOTI MobiControl or unenrolled. When we click Next, we'll move to the final page of enrollment policy, which is Settings. Here we can do tasks such as changing the enrolled device name, whether we want this to be auto-numbered or whether we'd like to pull in another value to the device, such as the device MAC address or the device model. We can also say what will happen if the device is unenrolled and then re-enrolled back into SOTI MobiControl. Will its previous location or previous name be remembered? We can also enforce settings such as enrollment restrictions, indicating how many devices are allowed to be enrolled using this policy, or say whether a SOTI MobiControl web console admin approval is required to complete the enrollment process for this device. Once I've adjusted these settings as I require, once we click Finish, our enrollment policy is complete, and we're provided with a number of values. Firstly, we have our terms of use and discovery URLs. We can take these fields and add them back into the Microsoft Azure or Entra ID portal. Secondly, we have our enrollment policy PIN. This will be used on the device within the enrollment process. So before we move over to enrolling the device, let's copy the terms of use URL and discovery URL and go back to the Entra ID portal one more time and see where these values are added. So returning to Microsoft Entra ID, I'll search for mobility, MDM and WIP. When I select this, we can see that there's an already existing SOTI MobiControl application that is listed. Now this was created during the earlier integration that we saw when we were looking at the global settings area of SOTI MobiControl. However, if you don't see this listed here, you can manually add application and choose SOTI MobiControl from the list. We'll then need to click on the application and make some changes. So firstly, we'll adjust the default MDM terms of use URL and MDM discovery URLs. Instead, we'll add the specific values that we took from our enrollment policy in SOTI MobiControl. We'll also need to adjust the MDM user scope. This refers to the user groups in Microsoft Entra ID. Now, when somebody from one of those user groups initiates the device enrollment process, the device will be redirected to this specific application. So we can either select some and choose the specific groups that we require, in my case, frontline device users, or we can say all, indicating that all user groups in Microsoft Entra ID will be redirected to this application if they enroll a device. So to review, when a user of a recognized Entra ID user group starts the device enrollment process, the device will be redirected to this application and in turn be redirected to the specific terms of use from the SOTI MobiControl enrollment policy. So these are your company terms and conditions that you require your users to know and accept that we added in the enrollment policy. And in turn, also the specific discovery URL for the enrollment policy. So the device will enroll into SOTI MobiControl and into the specific SOTI MobiControl device group. I'll click Save. We can now see that these settings have updated, and we'll return to mobility, MDM and WIP one last time. And the other thing we need to do is just make sure that the default application has a user scope marked as none. We now have our directory connection established, our enrollment policy created in SOTI MobiControl, and the information required in mobility, MDM and WIP in Microsoft Entra ID. We should now be able to go to a device and see the device side enrollment experience. On the device, we'll search for Access Work or School, select Connect for adding a work or school account, and then we'll sign in with our user. And in our example, we're using Marcus. Once Marcus adds his credentials, he's prompted to add the policy pin from our SOTI MobiControl enrollment policy. And once the pin is added, we're then prompted to review, read and accept your company terms and conditions that were added in the enrollment policy as well. Once this is done, the device will register and in a few moments it will enroll into SOTI MobiControl. The account is now added and we can see that the device is now managed by SOTI MobiControl. The device is also visible in SOTI MobiControl and we can click on the device details. Specifically, if I click on users, you can see that Marcus is the assigned user. However, you may see that some actions, such as remote control, are currently not available. Why is this? Now, we'd refer to the way that the Windows modern devices enroll into SOTI MobiControl as an agentless enrollment, meaning that the capability of communicating with SOTI MobiControl is built into the Windows modern operating system for professional, enterprise, and IoT enterprise editions of Windows Modern. When the device does enroll, it communicates with a component on SOTI MobiControl called the deployment server extensions. Once the device is enrolled, the deployment server extensions will inform the device to install the SOTI MobiControl agent. The SOTI MobiControl agent provides additional advanced functionality such as remote control, file sync, and other options as well. Once the agent is enrolled, it also communicates to SOTI MobiControl to a component called the deployment server. Now, this process is automatic, but it is important to make sure that the device can communicate outbound to your SOTI MobiControl server on the 2 ports that you can see listed. As mentioned, this process is automatic and should take place within a few minutes. And if I return to my device on SOTI MobiControl, I can now see that the remote control capability is now available, indicating that the agent has installed and all those advanced capabilities are now available. Finally, if the enrollment process does not complete successfully, here are a few common places to start your troubleshooting. check whether the Windows edition is supported. The supported editions are Professional, Enterprise and IoT Enterprise editions of Windows Modern. If the device is not brand new, check if there are any enrollment packages or PPKG files that have been used previously. You can check this on the device by going back to work or school and then checking underneath the Add or Remove Provisioning Package option. Additionally, check if there are any previous MDM enrollments that have not been removed successfully. Review any on-premise or cloud directory settings or GPO group policy settings that may interfere with enrollment. And finally, keep in mind the user scope in Microsoft Entra ID in the Mobility, MDM and WIP section. As a reminder, we need to make sure that the SOTI MobiControl application has a user scope of either some, including the user groups that we require, or all, and the default application has a user scope of none. Thank you for joining us in this video where we've reviewed how to enroll a Windows Modern device using Microsoft Entra ID Join with SOTI MobiControl Cloud. We've seen how to create the directory connection for Microsoft Entra ID, walked through the enrollment policy creation, and seen the seamless device-side enrollment experience. Furthermore, what we've seen today can be used as a foundation for a fully automated device enrollment experience using Windows Autopilot and SOTI MobiControl. For more resources, like and subscribe to the SOTI YouTube channel. And for more information about the SOTI One platform, visit soti.net.